Hello, I'm Hannah, the designer behind House of Brick Designs. I've created a line of patterns specifically for plus-size women who love historical and vintage dress. In this video, I will be walking you through the construction of my Angelina blouse, View B, which is the more historical view. I've broken this process down into subsections, and will include the timestamps down below in the show notes in case you want to skip ahead to certain sections. You'll also find a link to my pattern, just in case you found this video from YouTube itself and not through my Etsy store. If you love historically inspired clothes as much as I do, I hope this pattern will help you create a garment you love.
Alright, so we're looking at my pattern layout to start. Laying out all the pieces, trying to pay attention to the grain line on all of them, and noticing that I needed a second collar piece because this is cut to, but I've got it on fold. So here's a new collar piece. So I've got two collars. When I cut, I like to use a rotary cutter. I feel like it speeds things up. It's much more accurate. So I like to preserve all my sizes. So as you can see on this sleeve pattern piece, I'm transferring the size lines directly onto the fabric. And then I will cut along the marked line. You can also see there's a flaw on the fabric that was towards the front corner of the sleeve that I'm avoiding cutting out. And once I have things cut out, I often like to go back and double check that I've marked all my notches. Sometimes they don't really transfer that well, and you need to make sure that they are there for your future construction process. Here I am laying out my back piece, which actually has a back opening in the finished garment, and I'm taking advantage of the fact that this fabric used to be curtains. So there's a nice finished edge there that I would like to utilize for my own center back. Once again, transferring the pattern cut line directly onto the fabric, because there's a lot of lines in this pattern. Alright, once I have all my marks transferred, I go ahead and cut directly on those lines. Here I have pinned my pattern pieces together because this delicate batiste-like fabric, I don't want it to separate or lose track of my inner and outer sides. Honestly, on this fabric, you really can't tell, but I just want to keep track of it. And lastly, I'm utilizing some offcuts. These I think were actually facings on the top of the curtains that I took off. So I'm utilizing this fabric because it's the perfect size to cut out my waistband piece, as you can see. This particular pattern piece, the waistband, it was a lot easier for me to just make a new pattern piece to work with. And you can see I'm going to cut two of them because I need an inside waistband and an outside waistband. And they're exactly the same pattern piece. You can see I marked my notches as I'm going through this, but I often feel like I need to remark those notches. It's like most of it ends up getting cut off, and you just need to make sure that that's really clear for yourself during the construction process. This is really the fun part, just being able to peel away the excess fabric. I love this part of rotary cutting and remarking those notches. Like I said, like they were just enough for me to see then. I knew I would need them to be a little more obvious in the future construction of this garment. And marking those notches a second time because you never know. Alright, so here we are putting together the front section. We've got this plastron here that is something I put together off camera, but if you're interested in seeing that in more detail, please let me know in the comments, and I'll put together another video where I detail that process. So I've got the side front and the plastron pinned together, and I'm stitching them together at 1/4 inch here because I am French seaming this whole project together as much as possible. I like to encase the raw edges, and I really felt like on this particular project, due to the sheerness of this batiste fabric, that just serging them, you would see that right through the fabric, and it just was going to look tacky. So I made the executive decision to French seam or encase my raw edges as much as possible on this entire project. Actually, it turned out quite successful. Now that I have this particular seam sewn, I'm trimming down the seam allowance so it's even less than the 1/4 inch that I just stitched it at, trimming it down to about 1/8 of an inch so that when I turn this around, it will flip it over. It'll not stick through the second seam that I have to sew for the French seam. So this is the other side of that plastron, pinning the other side section on, and you can see here, easing this garment together, I'm lining up some notches, and I like to line up my notches and my ends and then just sort of coax the pieces together, doing a little bit of easing, making note of where I may have more fullness and if I need to adjust that through pinning or putting that fuller section of fabric towards the feed dogs, because that would act as a slight gather just to kind of ease that piece in. So once again, sewing at 1/4 inch, half of my seam allowance. Here we can see I am actually trimming my seam allowance down using my rotary cutter. It's actually way more efficient than those tiny little snips that I was using on the previous seam, but doing it over here actually also allows me to go ahead and press these seams open because that will make for a much nicer finished product. I hate pressing too. It's a pain in the butt, but it does make for a nicer finish. Here we are stitching those seams a second time using that 1/4 inch and encasing the raw edges of that first pass so that it will be a nice finished seam. No raw edges exposed. So here you can see the finished product. Doesn't that look nice from the outside? So clean. So the next step is the gathering of the shoulders on the front. I've got my stitch length set as long as possible, and I like to do 2 passes of stitching for my gathers. It just makes it easier to control where the gathers land. Here I am stay stitching the neck opening or the neck edge just to keep these bias edges from stretching while I'm working on this garment. And here I am pulling those gathers in to match the back shoulder. What I've done is I've pinned each end of the shoulder and then pulling the gathers so that the front piece pulls in to match the width of the back shoulder piece. And then I pinned it in place and stitched it. So this particular seam, I'm actually not doing a French seam. I'm doing a flat fell seam because French seaming with a gathered edge is asking for trouble. It's not very effective. I think it would be a big mess. So what I'm actually going to do is cut off one side of the seam allowance, the gathered side, and encase it with the other side of the seam allowance. You'll see this process in a second. So here I am, I'm going to press this seam open so that I've separated the gathered side from the flat side, and as you can see, it also makes the seam look so much nicer on the outside when you press all your seams. So this is the gathered side that I've got pressed down to the cutting mat, and I'm just going to cut it off with the rotary blade at about half the seam allowance. Here's the second shoulder, doing the same exact thing. And then going back to pressing, and I'm actually going to take the back shoulder seam allowance now and sort of press it forward. I'm actually doing a little light finger press to kind of coax it into place so that I can take this folded edge that I'm creating here once I iron it and roll it forward so it encases the gathered section of the seam allowance so that there will be no raw edges exposed. Once that's pressed down, I flip it forward, pin it in place, and I'm back at the machine stitching that in place so that all my raw edges are fully encased within the garment and nothing's exposed. Here I'm using this pin I just pulled out to sort of like corral the gathers to make sure that nothing gets folded over or ends up looking unattractive. Alright, and here we are putting together the side seam. Pinning it. It looks like I've already done a single pass because I'm French seaming the side seam. Once again, no gathers, no need for flat fell seams. Once again, a lovely finished seam encasing all my raw edges. And you can see I'm demonstrating good practice here by actually pulling out my pins before I stitch over them. Not always good about doing that. Alright, so now we're moving on to the sleeves. Here I'm pinning the sleeve facing together with the sleeve itself. These are right sides together because this sleeve facing is going to be flipped to the inside when it's finished. But right now what I've done is I've lined up the notches that are on the wrist edge of the sleeve, and there's a little inverted V shape that's on both the sleeve facing and the sleeve itself. Those are going to be our stitch lines. So once everything's pinned together, go ahead and stitch directly along those lines. Wish it was a little more visible for you, but trust me, I'm just following the stitch line up here to the peak of that V. Going ahead and turning, rotating, giving it one stitch over before completing that rotation. This is going to give me just a little bit more room at the top corner when I snip into that in the next step. So here I am on the sleeve pressing board. First I'm going to finger press under the edges of this sleeve facing. Give it a nice little finger press. This just makes it so much easier to get the fabric to cooperate with the iron, and because it is such a nice batiste fabric, it is really cooperative with finger pressing. Not everything likes to take this, but just a little bit of pressure and with the warmth of your fingers just kind of like starts that press off so nicely and just makes it that much more easy to get the finished result that you want. So I'm kind of eyeballing it here and giving myself a 1/2 inch press under on all these edges. And this will be really nice to have already done when I go ahead and flip it. So now I'm cutting into that V all the way up to the top point. Very carefully, don't want to cut through any of your stitches because then you'd have to go redo that stitch line. And then pressing that seam so it gives it a nice crisp edge there. I'm also going to the trouble of pressing open that seam. This is the cut edge that I'm pressing open to just make sure I get a really crisp finish on this particular edge. As you can see, I've flipped the sleeve facing so that it is now to the inside of the sleeve. So all those folds that I just pressed under before are tucked in nice and neat, and I'm just giving it a final nice press to get everything really crisply laying in place. So I'm just giving it a few pins, pinning it in place to make sure that nothing shifts when I move over to the machine and stitch this bad boy down. So I'm using a really close edge stitching along here, stitching from the inside so I can see where my edge is, and making sure not to hit any of these pins. Going up to the corners and just doing a really clean release and pivot, and then continuing along my stitch line. Leaving the needle in place when you pivot around, just make sure that nothing shifts. Your stitch line doesn't get jagged. It's an easy thing to forget, but it just makes for a nicer finish. Alright, and with the facing finished, because it's so much easier to work with it when the sleeve is open and flat, I'm now sewing together the underarm seam so that this will turn the sleeve into a tube. Once again, I am doing a French seam so that I can encase all the raw edges of the seam allowance. So I'm stitching this at a 1/4 inch, going along, trimming this seam down from a 1/4 inch down to like a little 1/8 of an inch seam, and then pressing this seam. Because this seam is so small now, the seam allowance is just reduced to almost nothing, I'm just going to press it over to the side rather than doing a nice flat open press. And then here we are sewing the underarm seam again to encase all those raw edges. So once again, stitching it at a 1/4 inch. By trimming it down to an 1/8 of an inch, I ensure that no fiber, fabric, threads, whatever, are going to be visible sticking out of the finished seam. Alright, doing some gathering stitching along the wrist edge of the bottom of my sleeve. You can see I flubbed the cut there. There's that flaw. I'm just including it and stitching right over it because it will help give me my real seam allowance. I don't want to lose that. Here I am pinning my notches in place just as a visual guide for myself to make sure that I don't lose my place or run over where I'm trying to create my gathering stitches. Because I really just want these focused on the sleeve head and not anywhere else. So having a little pin there is just like a nice little extra visual guide. And making a second pass of stitching because it's just ingrained in me. You always do 2 rows of gathering stitches for the maximum, or actually bare minimum of control with gathers. But I want to make sure that none of my gathering stitches are visible to the outside. Here I have the cuff. I've already flat-lined it with a soft silk georgette. Normally I would go for a silk organza, but I did not have it. It's a sheer silk. It's just going to give a little bit more body to this cuff. And you can see I'm trimming my corners and then pressing open the ends here of this cuff. It's really hard to get this into a position where I can get it flat, but do your best. And then using this point turner to turn my corners so that they are nice and crisp and everything is really nice and square. And then pressing that into place. Here I have pinned the wrist edge of the sleeve into the cuff. It's only one side of the cuff, so this cuff is hanging open at this point. And what I've done is I've just pinned either end, and then I'm pulling the gathering in while it's attached to the cuff to try and determine just how many gathers I get, how tightly it's gathered, and, so that I can kind of corral and control where those gathers land on the cuff. I really want them to be evenly distributed. It just looks nicer to have them arranged evenly. At least that's the goal of this particular shirt. And now I am stitching down that sleeve into the cuff. I've got the gathers facing upwards so I can really see if anything goes wrong, if any folds pull over or get into a weird position. It's really easy if you did this the other way with the gathers face down, that weird little tucks happen and just end up having to redo your work. So here I am pressing the opposite side of that cuff now. The side that was not stitched down, I'm pressing it under a 1/2 inch so that it will be a little easier to manage when I pin it closed, as I'm doing here now. Everything's tucked in neatly, all the raw edges are encased, and here we are basting that sleeve closed. So I'm just doing a row of hand stitching, doesn't have to be anything too elaborate, just kind of running stitches with an occasional back stitch thrown in to make sure that the cuff doesn't shift when I use a machine to sew it closed. But what I'm trying to do is ensure that my stitches are following the stitch line from the outside so that they won't be visible. I've tried to pull my cuff over just a scant 1/16 of an inch, maybe as much of an 1/8 of an inch, but just a little bit over that seam line so that when I do flip it over and take the machine to it, that it will catch all of the cuff and everything will be nicely encased in there. See? Looks lovely. And now we make it permanent with the machine stitching. Nothing says forever like a row of machine stitches. I'm just stitching in the ditch here, so keeping it as close to that seam as possible so that you don't notice my stitches, and just getting everything really nailed down. And here I am sewing the sleeve into the arm side now. Very carefully, making sure that all the gathers are put into place. Sorry I pinned the arm side in place off screen, but really what I did was line up the underarm seam of the sleeve with the side seam of the bodice, line up the notches for the front and the back. All of that underarm area should be really flat, and that creates all of your gathering and easing happening on the top of the shoulder, which is where you want the fullness to be. Extra fullness in the underarm, usually not desirable. I'm pulling out my extra gathering stitches here because I'm trimming off the gathered section of this sleeve arm size seam. The plan here is to create another flat felled seam because gathered seams just don't make good French seams. So right now I'm trimming down the gathered side to about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch, but I want it to be a little less than 1/4 inch because if it's longer than that it would stick out. And here I am pressing the uncut side of the arm side down in half so that that pressed fold is about 1/4 inch wide. That's why I don't want the cut edge to be any wider than 1/4 inch, ideally a little bit less. Just carefully going around the arm side in sections, pressing in that seam allowance so I have a nice crisp fold to work with. And then here I am stitching it in place. So that means that the folded edge is actually pressed over onto the sleeve piece and stitched down. So there's an extra line of stitching running around the sleeve itself at about a little more than 1/8 of an inch away from that seam edge. But honestly, since it's consistent all the way around, no one's ever going to notice it. So I went ahead and interlined this collar off camera with a sheer silk georgette. Not the ideal interlining, but I didn't have organza and it needed just a little bit of extra stiffness that the body of the fabric alone was not going to provide for a collar. So I am here pinning together the collar right sides together, starting on the outside corners and working my way towards the inside, making sure to not stretch this too much as the curved edges of the collar are likely to distort a little bit if you worry them too much. Just that little bit of extra bias edge is really an easy place to stretch things out, and I really don't want to do that. I'm just trying to ease this together and make sure everything lines up. It should line up pretty well given that these pieces were both cut from the exact same pattern, but the interlining and whatnot, that could lead to a little bit of shrinkage. So Here I am stitching the sides and the top, hitting that corner, doing a pivot directly on the corner, and continuing along. Everything is stitched at 1/2 inch because this collar piece is going to be flipped right side out. When I'm done, everything will be encased within the piece itself, no raw edges exposed at all. Carefully going along here, making sure to pull out my pins as I sew. Well, mostly making sure to pull out my pins as I go. Try not to sew over your pins, kids. It's a bad idea. It doesn't always lead to broken needles, but often enough. Alright, and here I am clipping the corners. Just trying to reduce the bulk of the seam allowance so that when I do press this right side out, there will not be any big lumps or ugliness. And here we are understitching the collar. I didn't go ahead and press this first like I should have, but I'm just giving it a finger press as I go, and that's pretty effective with this really soft, nice batiste. So as you can see, the stitching is to the right side of the seam, just to the right. I'm trying to keep it a scant 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of the seam. And that understitching is going to help the collar roll inwards towards my neckline, just at that seam, so that you don't see any of the interior fabric poking up past the seam line. It's just like a little trick to help give you a really nice, really crisp finish. And here I am grading down that seam after I have understitched it. It's hard to tell, but this is actually the underside that is being trimmed down. So the side that I actually added the extra layer of silk to. And you can see just how sheer that silk is that you cannot see it here. I'm also taking the time to grade down the short ends of this collar piece and clipping into the seam allowance on the long edge of the collar, just focused right around the curve, because you don't want the curve to fight you when you turn it. Basically, the concave curve, when you flip it right side out, will become a convex curve, meaning there won't be enough give in the fabric to move correctly and will lead to pulling and ugliness. Basically, if you want it to look right, you gotta clip. Here I am turning that corner, using a pin to neaten that up, just to get the last little bits of that corner nice and pulled out. And now we're pressing. Pressing everything is always really important, and it's also going to help encourage that roll line that we stitched in with the understitching to just really stay in place. Very nice and crisp looking. Here I am just first finger pressing the underside, what will be the inside collar, double checking that it's at 1/2 inch before I go ahead and nail it down with the iron and steam. This is going to make finishing the inside a lot easier. Pinning the collar onto the neckline now, carefully making sure that everything is nice and smooth and even. You want to be careful not to add any tucks or weirdness into the seam when you sew it. So pinning it so that everything is really smooth is really important, because the tighter curve of the neckline on the body of the shirt versus the softer, straighter, less curved collar, it's a really easy spot to introduce accidental wrinkles or tucks in your seam. So careful pinning and careful stitching will lead to a better result. Here we are, stitching that collar on, attempting to pull out pins as I go. Not always the best at that. Do as I say, not as I do. Alright, and here we are. We're pressing that neck seam up into the collar and then pinning down that collar so it's really nice and neat. Once again, because this is a curved area, I'm trying to be careful not to worry or stretch or pull on this fabric too much, because it can get distorted relatively easy between the bias of the curve and the soft batiste fabric. So I'm just pinning this collar flat carefully, and you can see where the pins are landing, that this is just overlapping just enough that stitching this down will be pretty easy. But first, I'm still going to baste this collar in place by hand. I'm stitching in the ditch, which means along or in that initial seam line as much as possible. And it's a lot easier to control that when you're hand stitching it. And by doing this, it will allow me to take all my pins out and not have to worry about any of those when I sit down to sew this at the machine. It will also help me assure that there will be absolutely no problems. And here I'm hand stitching the ends of the collar closed. There's a little bit of collar overlap that happens at the center back, and it's a short little section. It makes for a much neater finish to just slip stitch these together. Well, it's a pretty sloppy slip stitch. I think I might actually be basically doing a running stitch to close it, but honestly, it doesn't take a whole lot of strain, and finishing it up by hand looks so much nicer. So, machine stitching, once I've got things basted in place, it's a lot easier to just machine stitch along, stitch in the ditch, and make sure that the stitch line is invisible as a result, and everything is nailed into place. Okay, starting off, this is the waistband, and much like the collar, I decided to make the waistband interlined. You can see here I'm marking my corners by measuring from the edges where my seam allowance should be so I can make a really crisp corner here. But like I said, this waistband is interlined. It's actually on the other side, the side you're not seeing, with a silk georgette, just something I had in my stash. Would have really rather used organza, but organza was not something I had on hand. And I'm just stitching along here at a 1/2 inch from the edge because there's an inside and an outside, or a front and a back to this waistband, and it's going to be flipped right side out when it's finished, and all of the raw edges will be encased within the waistband itself. And here I am trying to be careful and pull out my pins as I go. Make sure not to sew over your pins. You're gonna have a bad time if you do. So once again, approaching the corner. I've already marked where my corner is, and I'm just trying to make sure I really stick that landing so I can make for a really crisp corner point, and I'm careful about pivoting with the needle down. And you can see here now I'm trimming down my corners so that fabric will not be in the way when I turn this right side out. I'm also grading down my seam allowance. Now what I'm focusing on here is the side that I interlined. I'm grading down both the outside fabric itself, and I'm further grading down the interlining. So the outer fabric is getting cut down to about a 1/4 inch, and then the interlining is getting cut down separately right up to the edge of the stitching. Here you can see I've laid down the waistband and discovered this method is much easier for trimming down this very long bit of fabric. This is just a continuation of the grading, and you can see how I'm leaving behind the front waistband, the waistband that you'll actually be seeing when I'm wearing it. It's still at full width. So once again, trimming down the center back of this waistband, grading down the center back seam allowance of this waistband. And now I'm coming back here and cutting the silk interlining fabric down so that it's right up against the stitch line. So that there's probably going to be about a 1/16 of an inch of this fabric left behind. And yeah, once I got a bit of the silk in my hand so I could pull as I was cutting, it became much easier. So I am also going to be understitching this waistband so that I can really control this seam edge and really make it roll in the direction I want it to. So kind of like finger press to seam allowances all over here to the left side of the seam, and then I am going to be stitching on top of those seam allowances. It can be kind of hard to tell at this angle, but the needle is basically stitching just to the left, about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam line. And what this does is it's going to really force this bottom edge of the waistband to roll inward slightly so that the inside waistband will never actually be visible from the outer garment. So this is just a little trick that I always like to do. It's the technique that really helps make garments look really nice and finished. Here I've got the end of the waistband and I'm pressing it. This little corner is really hard to get into to press it all the way, but then I'm using this point turner, this vintage tool, to coax the corner into a really nice start point, made easier by the fact that I just trimmed with the piece inside of the thing. And all that trimming is being reinforced now by the iron going along and really just ironing that roll into place. So there's just like a scant hair of the outside fabric that is pressed around the corner. And now what I'm doing is I'm measuring the inner edge of the waistband, the seam allowance, and I'm going to press it down before I stitch this waistband onto the garment. Giving it a nice finger press first because it's going to be a long bit of pressing. And you can see it's not perfect, but this finger pressing is actually pretty effective, especially on a nice fine fabric like this. So, and this is actually, I've moved on to the curved section of this waistband now. You want to make sure that you're pretty careful with the curved section because there is that added bias that is starting to happen now on the fabric, and it can get twisted and pulled out of grain really easily in that spot. And it can also stretch a little bit. You really want to avoid stretching out this piece of fabric if you can help it. So just finishing off the end of the waistband, trying to get that pressed edge to come all the way to the seam edge so that it makes for a really nice finish. And here I am actually finally doing my gathering stitching on the bottom edge of the shirt body. I know this is probably one of the first steps that I actually instructed you to do, but honestly, as long as you do your gathering stitches before you put the waistband on, that's the right time to do the gathering stitches. I'm so bad at following directions, I can't even follow my own written directions, to be honest. And you can see here I'm doing the front sections and the back sections of the shirt separately, so that each one will have its own section of gathering, and I'll be able to use that to corral the shirt differently. My plan here is actually to gather the back section of the shirt so it's fairly evenly distributed on its section of the waistband, and then the front of the shirt, all the gathers will be pushed forward towards that plastron center section in the hopes that what I will achieve will actually be a more historical looking blouse. And here now I have pinned the shirt body to the waistband, the right sides together. I've got this side seam here pinned, and I'm gathering between the side seam and the center back placement, using that to sort of determine where my gathers are going to go and trying to distribute them fairly evenly across the piece, at least for this back section. I mean, obviously your shirt is your shirt, and if you want to distribute your gathers in a more centered way or a focused way, then that is certainly your call to make. And here I am actually taking the time to make sure that my stitch length is properly shortened. You have a bad time if you tried to stitch this thing on the basting length. But now I'm stitching in the shirt to the waistband. The waistband is actually folded open and on the underside, so I'm careful not to catch the wrong section of the waistband. And I've got the gathers facing up so that I can really keep my eye on what they're doing and how they're laying. The last thing I want is for something to get weirdly tucked or misarranged, misaligned, so I'm carefully stopping here, using my pin to sort of coax those gathers into place and ensure that everything lays really nicely in the finished product. And along here you can see I've reached towards the front. This is where I really concentrated my front gathers, so I'm just being really careful here that everything is staying nice and tightly corralled in the place that I want them to be before I move along to the actual center front section, which I left really flat because I wanted to show off all of the lace detailing that I put in. So now that the waistband is sewn on, the inside waistband can now be folded over and laid in place. Pre-pressing that edge really helps with this process because it already is laying where you want it to. And I'm being careful as I pin here to make sure that the waistband bottom edge is really rolling into the inside, so I don't have any of the inner waistband showing to the outside. And I also want to make sure that this folded edge that I'm pinning overlaps my stitch line by at least a 1/16 of an inch. I really want to have enough of it sticking over that stitch edge that I just made that I can catch it again when I stitch from the outside in the ditch to close this thing up. And here at the end of the waistband, it doesn't have any shirt in it. I'm going to try and be careful and make sure that that end lays really nicely, closes up really nicely, and actually lines up a little more than the rest of the inner waistband because this part is more likely to show. Alright, and here I am hand basting the waistband into place. So this is actually the outside of the garment, the view from the outside. And you can see I'm stitching in the ditch, basically along that seam that I have just sewn, so that my stitches are invisible to the naked eye, and I'm catching the waistband edge that's on the inside. If you look carefully, you can see just a smidgen of more whiter section just above this edge that I'm stitching, and that tells you how much overlap the inside waistband has. buttons. So this is just another angle showing the same process, or a continuation of the process. So you can really see where that needle is just stitching right along that seam line and catching the underside of the waistband. And these can be pretty long stitches. I made them a little bit on the small side because I was feeling like I didn't want to have to take them out afterwards. But you can see just where the stitches are catching that inner waistband. And now to finally sew down by machine the seam that I already just basted in place. By basting it, I ensure that I don't have to worry about any pins being in the way, and I can just really carefully make sure that the whole thing is stitched down. And also sort of like spread the seam apart so that there's no fold. Really, I should have sat down and ironed this before I did the stitching. Right after I stitched this seam the first time, I should have gone to the ironing board, but I didn't. I get a little lazy sometimes, but here I am basically giving it a version of a finger press to make sure that the whole thing is really flat and smooth as I stitch along to make sure that my stitching doesn't show. Alright, here I am trying to decide on which buttons I wanted to use to finish off the back of this shirt. And I really wanted to use one of these etched buttons, but as you can see I'm laying them here just to see what they look like with the shirt fabric. And while they look nice, these larger buttons down here, a little on the big side. The smaller version, there just wasn't enough of them, and they're also kind of dark. So in the end I decided against those. The two types of buttons above them, of those two, these other etched buttons just had this weird sticky residue that I just didn't want to deal with at the time, so I went with the very simple plain vintage buttons. Here I am marking out my button placement. It's actually my buttonhole placement, but what I do is I like to start with a 1/2 inch from the top and bottom of my waistband and my collar, and then I've already decided I need more buttons than this gauge will actually accommodate for. The gauge I'm about to use is only 8 spots that it marks out, so I kind of guesstimated about what my spacing would be in order to mark the next notches down from those first marks that I made, and then I used the gauge to line everything up and get some nicely evenly spaced buttonhole placement without having to do math, essentially. It pretty much worked. And so here I am measuring the width of the button itself. Unfortunately, this little button gauge is in lines, which is not really an easy translation to centimeters or inches. So what I did was I just measured the width that the gauge ended up at. I made sure it was slightly larger than the button itself, and then I used my seam gauge as my marker for how big to make those buttonholes, centering it on the little dots that I had previously marked out. Not the most scientific, but hey, this is a hobby where we do the thing that works. So you can see here, the center dot is what I originally marked, and then the line is the buttonhole length that I will be using, which the button will fit through nicely. First I decided to go ahead and sew my buttons on. Off screen, I used the marks that I'd already made on the buttonhole side in order to just transfer them over to the other side of the shirt so I could not have to go through that process again of figuring out where my buttons would land. Just line them up with where the buttonholes are going to be. You can see here I'm sewing on one of my last buttons, and I'm going to demonstrate a technique that I like to use, which is called creating a thread shank. These buttons do not naturally have a shank, but if you sew the button on really tightly to the shirt, then you get weird puckering, pulling. There just isn't enough room for the fabric and the buttonhole to lay between the button and the fabric it's sewn to. So I try to use my finger to create a little bit of a space between the fabric that the button is being sewn to and the button itself. And once you pass enough stitches through the button to make it secure, then I wrap that thread shank with more thread, the same thread that I'm sewing with, in order to just protect those threads. It makes it a really nice, long-wearing, stitched-on button. And then I'll tie my knot on the underside of the garment where it's going to be getting a lot less wear and tear. You can kind of see just how spaced out the button is. Pull it away here from the fabric so you can just see just a little bit. It's enough. And then I'll tie my knot on the back here and bury my thread. And here I am cutting the buttonholes first because my plan is to hand sew these buttonholes. So I just got this chisel recently. I really like this process of cutting the buttonholes with a chisel. Just never have to worry about cutting them too long that way, honestly. So what I'm doing here is a buttonhole stitch. Also can be known as a blanket stitch. It's very similar, but this is much smaller and finer, and I'm trying to get these button stitches right up next to each other. You don't have to hand stitch your buttonholes. I just chose to on this particular garment. Based on a lot of the shirt-waist blouses that I've seen that are from the turn of the 20th century, they have surprisingly sloppy buttonholes, and I really felt like it gave me permission to make a hand-sewn buttonhole that wasn't perfect. You know, it is really easy when you hand-sew a buttonhole to stretch the sides out a little bit much, and while I was trying to be careful, I also had like 10 of these to sew, so I wasn't going to be that careful. But yeah, I just feel like it gave it a nicer finish. Sure, I could have done it by machine, no one would have ever noticed, but I know it's there. I like it. It makes me happy. I feel like it's worth the time to just do it this way. And honestly, I was really trying to, while I wasn't trying to perfectly recreate a turn of the century shirt-waist blouse, I did really want a blouse that would echo a lot of the details that are in those blouses. And once again, I like to finish off my stitching by making sure that that knot is on the underside. Probably should have sewn it a little bit away from the buttonhole, but to be honest, just wanted to get it done. And this won't see that much wear and tear. So here I am marking the button placement on the cuffs, or actually the buttonhole placement, because I'm making sure that the buttonholes are going to be wide enough to accommodate this slightly smaller button that I'm using on the cuffs. And then kind of using a gauge to make sure that these are even with my finished edges on the cuffs. Going ahead and marking my width real carefully and trying to make sure they're nice and square. And then once again using a chisel to cut them. Now you might be able to tell I actually stitched around the buttonhole before I cut with the chisel to just give it a little bit of extra stabilization. And then once I had the buttonhole stitched, because really we need to see more buttonhole stitching, I actually wrapped this sleeve cuff around my wrist to determine exactly where I wanted to place the buttons. You see, I didn't really check the wrist size as I was making up this blouse, and I realized afterwards that they got a little bit big. Like, I could have used a smaller size just for my cuffs, but I didn't think of that, and really having this much of an underlap in the cuffs, not that big a deal to me. I don't mind. I hope this walk through the construction process has been helpful to you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. And you can click the bell icon to be notified the next time I upload.